Thank you, Jason, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Gord Sterritt, the Executive Director for the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance. I'm also a member of the Gitxsan Nation located in the Skeena watershed. And my presentation that I'm going to present to you, while it's attributed to the Upper Fraser, people are going to recognize some of the values and the issues more broadly. So I thank you, and I'll start my presentation. So in 2008, a two-day conference was organized and hosted by the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs. The focus was on Indigenous peoples and climate change. An article that resulted from this workshop summarized the key issues that were identified as they relate to Indigenous people. Regional and global assessments confirm that the Earth's climate is changing and that some of the environments and peoples are significantly more vulnerable to its impacts than others. The study also summarized that Indigenous peoples depend on natural resources for their livelihood while often inhabiting diverse but fragile ecosystems, and that Indigenous peoples are among the world's most marginalized, impoverished, and vulnerable peoples. Meaning that while Indigenous peoples bear the brunt of the effects of climate change, there is minimal access to resources to cope with the changes they are faced with. For Indigenous peoples around the world, climate change brings different kinds of risks, opportunities, threatens cultural survival, and undermines Indigenous human rights. The consequences of ecosystem changes have implications for the use, protection, and management of wildlife, fisheries, forests, affecting the customary uses of culturally and economically important species and resources. What this means from an Upper Fraser perspective. For many years, Upper Fraser First Nations have lived the decline of the resources they rely on to sustain them through the winter months, while simultaneously raising their concerns as such through standard processes, for example, the IFMP process. There are numerous Chinook and sockeye salmon populations in the Upper Fraser that have been identified by COSAWIC as endangered, with very slow processes working to determine next steps in dealing with their recovery, including dealing with climate change. This also applies to Interior Fraser coho and Interior Fraser steelhead issues, both of which have sustained a traditional food fishery. And with these declines also came increased health issues and food security issues. Believe it or not everyone has the luxury of going to the local grocery store to meet their needs. Community leadership has been forced to impose restrictions, often founded by traditional laws and necessity, on their people in order to preserve the biodiversity of salmon species and stocks that return to their respective territories for future generations. First Nations have a right to access these resources that are often intercepted by non-Indigenous activities, further compounding the effects of climate change by not allowing these resources the opportunity to reach their spawning areas. From an Upper Fraser perspective, it appears that everyone has access to the resources that originate in the Upper Fraser, but the ecosystem and Upper Fraser First Nations, which raises legal and institutional issues. And while not meant to diminish the impacts of climate change that everyone feels or observes, Indigenous communities, especially the Upper Fraser, have been subject to extreme natural events that continue to have detrimental effects on the traditional way of life and culture. So I won't place the blame entirely on climate change, however, as historical resource management practices have compounded in some cases, such as the pine beetle infestation and then recent wildfires in the Chilcotin and Amanika regions, both related, have accelerated those issues. The big bar slide has highlighted these local issues as we witnessed back-to-back 100 and 200-year flood events, in addition to the compounded by the recent wildfires, But climate change is most certainly having a significant impact on the resources we have always relied on. Extremely wet weather over the past year has already filled the water table to flood level before the 2021 freshet has even begun. I reference impacts to Indigenous culture, and you may wonder, how does climate change impact traditional knowledge and culture? The impacts to biological diversity referenced earlier also has bearing on the associated knowledge, culture, and practices. In a few short years, without continued practice, the traditional knowledge on how to properly prepare a salmon for a smokehouse, or the ATK indicator for when a particular species or stock should start to arrive to an area, signaling to communities, families, and individuals to prepare to look forward to communal events that mark the arrival and harvest of the salmon stands to be forgotten. With the loss of these events, the languages tied to the resources dies, and in some cases, this has already occurred. How to address these issues? Ensure full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the design and implementation of sustainable solutions. We have seen a few examples of this in recent years, with the catalyst being Big Bar Slide. Never before have I have seen the collaboration between government agencies and First Nations as we have in the response to Big Bar. Most, if not all, Indigenous communities along the Fraser and marine areas are aware of the slide and sacrifices made to accommodate the situation to getting salmon upriver. Upper Fraser First Nation communities are as involved as they choose to be in the planning and recovery of salmon stocks that return to their respective territories. The remediation efforts continue to be tripartite response, with DFO, BC, and Indigenous participants making decisions. And with that, I want to thank the PSF for this opportunity to speak, and I thank all of you for listening and look forward to the remainder of the presentations and the remainder of this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Gord. I was wondering at this particular time, I think we're a little bit ahead of the board. I don't know if Jason, if you wanted to chime in here at this particular time. I think we're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So where to from here? Did we have some thoughts on that? Is Francis ready?
Oh, Marcel, it's Jason here. Hopefully you can hear me. I think it's wonderful that we're a little ahead of schedule, and maybe this is a good time for us to see if people want to try the Slido, if we want to have if anybody has any questions for Gord, and if people don't have anything on the Slido, I've got a couple of things that I might throw out there just to extend some of the ideas and seeds that Gord planted in his talk for us. So, Gord, if you're okay with it, I'll maybe just throw a first question at you. And again, everybody who's on with us today, if you wanted to put a question in for us to put to Gord, you can put it into the Slido. Can participants see the Slido coordinates on the bottom? Oh, there we go. I love technology. So if you haven't used Slido before, you can log in, pose a question, and Marcel and I will be able to see it live as it comes up. Gord, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know that you're intimately involved in Big Bar, and I think a lot of people here on the call today would be interested to know what is the latest status of that, and what is it looking like in terms of what will need to be done for salmon this year?
Thanks, Jason. Well, right now we're preparing for the spring freshet. We're getting all the different contingency plans in place. We got fish wheels being lined up for a trap and transport program to move fish around the slide should they be detained at the slide. We've got a tagging program again with the fish wheel that'll occur down in Lillooet, and then also taking broodstock, early Stewart broodstock down to Cultus Lake. There's natal stream enhancement planning it's ongoing for both Chinook and sockeye. And sorry, I'm just looking at the questions that are popping up. And then really a lot of the works is right now the ongoing works with Hewitt and others companies that are in the area was to pull out, sort of back off, get ready for the spring freshet, install the naturalized fishway that we've talked about at other times, and then prepare, basically essentially preparing for what's to come, and just being ahead of schedule as far as trap and transport, collection of broodstock, and having all the pieces in play.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts and just a huge effort going to be underway again this year, as it has been in the past too. And certainly from the Pacific Salmon Foundation perspective, we see this as one of the most important salmon issues that is in front of us right now in British Columbia, with the populations of salmon that have to get past there, having had 2 years of very difficult conditions already, and so now a third year. So we certainly appreciate everything that you and the Upper Fraser First Nations are doing, Gord, along with the federal and provincial governments to try to solve that problem, and our full support is behind you on that. While you were addressing my big bar question, we did have a question come in from Melanie. Thank you, Melanie, for being brave to be the first person to put one of the Slido questions in. And she's asked about what was the study that you referenced at the start of your talk. Could you speak to that, Gord?
Yeah, I mean, I don't claim to be a climate change expert. I mean, the work that we're doing in the Upper Fraser addresses it, but we're not. It's not specifically dealing with climate change itself. Anyway, so I did some research trying to determine what kind of opportunities there have been in the past to discuss climate change, and came across an article that was called "Climate Change from an Indigenous Perspective." The author escapes me right now, but I do have that information. It could be Googled. It's a 4-page document that basically summarizes a 2-day workshop, and there's some pretty good information that comes out of that, and recommendations as well.
All right, Gord, thanks. I appreciate that. I think that's the only question we've had in on the Slido so far, but what a great start to our session today. I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. I know from having spent a lot of my working career in the northern central interior, sometimes conversations around salmon become coastally oriented, in particular because there's so much interest and attention on recreational and public fisheries, commercial fisheries that occur in the ocean. But really the interior is where the nursery grounds for a lot of these populations are. It's where many of the populations that are currently in trouble are living. And I know that UFFCA is an example, and your members are doing a lot within your territories to try to help turn things around for salmon. And again, we really appreciate that, and we're behind you 100%. I'll just check in.
There was one more question for Gord, if you want.
Oh, there's another question? Thank you, Derek. Let me just have a look at this. Sorry, folks, if I seem a little slow. I'm getting used to how to use technology. How do I accept this one, Amy? Sorry.
Yeah, it's already been accepted.
Oh, okay. So can Gord see that question? Gord, I'll read it out. I'm not sure what you can see on your end. The question is from Bruce Runciman at DFO. Do you have advice for how to match up the urgent action needed to address salmon conservation with the time needed to meaningfully engage, plan, and coordinate action across Indigenous groups, federal and provincial, territorial governments, and partners?
Well, I mean, I think meaningfully engage in the traditional sense means a long process, working to ensure everybody's involved, and basically consulting. I think now the time is you convene a working group or a steering committee. They're tasked with the job at hand, and they've got the maybe power is not the word, but they've got the mandate to implement action basically on the ground in real time. And I think that's important. I reference what I've seen and been involved in with Big Bar right from the start, and we've continued to evolve that. And at the same time, we've got projects going on in the Upper Fraser that takes on a sort of a similar look and form in order to get the work done. So I would say that would be my advice is, rather than worrying about consultation and engagement in the traditional sense, is that you embrace UNDRIP and the decision-making processes and strike steering committees that can do the work that needs to be done right now.